This is Bree Garrell, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, graduate students and everyone in between, cultural workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Dr. Johanna Faith Almiron, aka Kapwa, who is a longtime educator, organizer, and scholar currently based in Nyack, New York, and at the Institute for Research in African American Studies at Columbia University. Her award-winning scholarship on the visual artist Jean-Michel Basquiat has been featured nationally and internationally at major museums and galleries, including the Guggenheim, the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, the Nahmad Gallery, and the Queensland Gallery of Modern Art. She has penned groundbreaking cultural criticism in essays in LitHub, ArtNews, Public Seminar, LA Review of Book, Hyperallergic, Rizzoli Press, with recognition from the New York Times Shortlist and Vanity Fair. She has taught at Rutgers University-New Brunswick, the University of Connecticut at Storrs, Cooper Union School of the Art, University of Wisconsin-Madison, and the University of Hawai'i at Manoa. In today's conversation, we will discuss the relationship between Black studies and ethnic studies, the role of performance and movement in relation to identity and coalition building, and the philosophies and politics of Black artists and creatives who've guided and influenced the political and intellectual journey of Dr. Almiron. Good afternoon, Kappa. How are you doing today?
I'm great. So pleased to be here with you.
Yes, I am very excited to be sharing space with you today. So, if you don't mind, we can jump right in. First, I'd like to begin with your scholar, artist, organizer journey. Could you tell us a little bit about the evolution of your work and what questions in the study of Black life intrigue you and guide your thinking? Or maybe this is the more pointed question. What inspires your political, artistic, and scholarly work? And what were the formative experiences that politicized you and led you to Black studies?
Wow, thank you. Well, I would just say that I think it's such a gift and very much in line with Black studies epistemology to begin with your own genealogy. And so I just want to first claim my names. So my name is Johanna Faith Banyas Blado Cacho Dunang Parong Pasqua Almiron, and my children are also from the Everett and Johnson line. And so I just wanted to bring everybody in before we begin, but also wish love and blessings to you and your house as well.
Thank you so much.
I feel like, and I just want to also say too that I'm excited to be on the Black Studies podcast as a way to also claim my intellectual genealogy.
Yes.
So even in the question, I feel like the genesis, the influence, but also just like, you know, how do we all map our own journey and destiny? And so I've been sitting with this question about like, when did it begin and where are we now? And I feel like just for the purposes of like not recounting my whole life story, but explaining sort of my formal introduction to Black studies and then kind of zoom out in terms of the informal markers. So I just want to start out at Warner Hall at Oberlin College in Ohio. And I'm in a class called Jazz Dance with Adenike Sharpley. And at one point, she comes up to me and asks me about my dance background. And I say, well, I did some ballet and jazz growing up, because usually that's what people want to know. And I did Filipino folk dance all my life. And she goes, oh, that's it. And she invited me to audition for Dance Diaspora, which is an Afro-Atlantic dance company. And I have to say that was the first time any adult or like authority figure validated and affirmed my experience in Filipino folk dance as expertise. And I remember And that was really the beginning where I was in the dance company, and, she was trained by Sibylla Fort, who's descendant of Pearl Primus, and of course, Catherine Dunham. And then Catherine Dunham, is an anthropologist and so I really began to understand the relationship between history, the historical memory, and culture, and that and through dance. So that means that like everything that we embody in our movements, in our gestures, in the shape of our eyes, and like the way I just took a deep breath. Like me and my brother and sister always laugh when we are talking to each other because we do the same things, and you don't even notice that's one of the things that you do. But I definitely thought about how, and I would say also, the genius of dance diaspora was that it was always political. So there was always a combination of, we're going to perform at schools. We are going to, like, I went to the Gambia and Cuba with them, and I remember, I'm just going to go on this tangent, even though I told myself I wouldn't. But I just remember going.
Please do.
I remember going to Cuba, and my birthday is August 13th. And that's the same day as Fidel Castro's birthday. And they're like, Fidelita. And so even within, my own consciousness as a young person, but also as a performer, I'm understanding that, dancing in Cuba and dancing in the Gambia and understanding the diaspora, but also like having to negotiate my own racial identity as an Asian American, Pacific Islander, Filipino woman in these different spaces. All of it politicized me. But I would say that in addition to Johnny Coleman's blues aesthetic class, and that was when I remember there was a time, and I may have even done it at our class at Rutgers, where he played Ascension by John Coltrane, and we had to just sit with the music and think about how it sounded like revolution, how it sounded like protest. And so I feel like at Oberlin, I was very spoiled in terms of the radical love pedagogy that the Black Studies department had. And I would say that so those teachers were really influential. And I would say that Johnny Coleman, who's a visual artist, also, introduced me to Blues People by Amri Baraka. So a lot of my experience at Oberlin was about the connection between culture and social movements, between art and politics. And then, I also had the experience of Third World Studies. And at Oberlin, I was involved with the Third World Liberation Front and Third World House, Third World Co-op. There was a semester after kind of like having, I would say my first year at Oberlin was a trip, because it was like all the things that I had suspected and understood about race finally had vocabulary. Like I went to predominantly white schools, and I knew I was experiencing something, but I didn't have a way to articulate any of it. So I feel like I sort of had this explosion, like in terms of my own coming into consciousness, which led to a lot of activism at Oberlin. And activism doesn't always mean like showing up to class on time, like, or getting your requirements in. And that's not a knock on student activists, but to say that my own experience of student activism was its own scholarly journey. And I ended up sort of like prioritizing, I would say, let's just call it I want to call it the streets, but at a college, it's more like the sidewalk. So like I ended up, really being fed by organizing at Oberlin in a way that sort of alienated me from the sort of like standardized academic journey. So that's my way of saying I took a gap semester and came home to New York. and ended up going to Columbia University, which is interesting because that's where I am now. And I studied with Gary Yokihiro, who is helped to establish the Center for Race and Ethnicity there. And that was also during a time when I would say, mid 90s student activism and the emergence of multiculturalism as a good thing, was very much at its sort of like fever pitch. So I feel like after studying with Gary Yokihiro and meeting, he's from Hawaii, and I feel like, okay, in the words of the great philosopher Wu Paul,
Yes.
by way of Trixie Mattel, who was on Baby This Is Keke Palmer, the universe gives you stage directions. And I definitely think about, different markers throughout my time, that I was studying with a local Japanese descendant of plantation workers from Hawaii who was trained in African studies in New York, and that he was one of the, sort of founding thinkers of third world studies. When I went back to Oberlin, I had a different understanding about the linkage between Asian American studies and African American studies by way of empire. And I feel like that was really the gift for me when I was feeling a bit displaced. Like, here I am, this like shorty doo-wop pinai in a Black dance company, like trying to figure out like, what am I doing here? And how is it that, it was a different kind of, like, I think about Jose Munoz's disidentifications and, how I've always been an insider outsider in every aspect of my work, but that at the time in college, I did not understand how that could be a superpower. I was still really wrestling with it as something that I didn't know what to do with. But I would just say that, Oberlin was really formative in that way. And I would say that Black studies led me back to my own roots as a Filipina, descendant of plantation workers in Hawaii, and helped me really understand how necessary it would be for me to know all the names that I shared with you in the beginning. And it was really the space and the mission, I believe, of Black studies that helps us to see ourselves as vessels of the history that we come from, but also agents of the history that we can make.
Yes. Oh my gosh. Thank you so much. I got so excited when you shared about the jazz dance class and jazz being this space and vehicle, and then dance itself like as this practice that really kind of, in a way, I feel like politicized how you were thinking about like knowledge, meaning making in our bodies, and like especially when you called the attention to like the blinking, the silence, the breath, like how that is so integral to not just like our lived existence, but it really informs how we think and get to relate and be with others. And then also when you're bringing in the blues and just like these different musical forms as being so integral to your development as not just as artists, but as active participant in this world in relation to other people and people across geographies, because you're traveling and it's almost being like this, I don't want to call it a rubric, but it's kind of, it offers you a dimension to be in, to be with others. I appreciate you sharing your journey. It's very interesting and fascinating. And I really loved when you were talking about like your student activism in the sidewalks and the streets as being like integral spaces that politicize you in this way, because you're intellectual and creative endeavors are not separated from the life that you live. And I think sharing that, I appreciate that a lot. And I really liked when you mentioned the RuPaul, the universe gives you stage directions, because I believe that, and especially as you talked and then it became so full circle. And I feel like that really tied that in. I'd like to ask, moving from this question, how do you imagine the field of Black studies, especially as you're telling me you were taking like the jazz class and you were learning about like blues aesthetics and just different Black epistemologies, like from those experiences and then from the work that you currently do, still operating within and outside of the university, how do you imagine the field of Black studies given its origins and like student and community activism and how it has established and explored the idea of a Black intellectual tradition?
Yes. No, thank you so much for this question. It's interesting because I remember previewing the questions and thinking about, the idea of the study of Black life, and is that something that I do? And I think about my own experience in Black studies, not so much as somebody who is studying Black life, but somebody who is committed to the Black Liberation Project. And I would say that the difference of that for me is not to diminish anybody who studies Black life as a subject, but to say that my own dialectic to the field is very much a part of my political commitments. And I would say that's very much because I was trained in ethnic studies, and that I think about Black studies as the leader of that movement. So if the movement, or if the study was born out of, let's say, the Panthers, let's say the movement, that student activist at Columbia or in Ohio, that the studies was really came out of student struggle and student leadership and student activism, which is, again, why it's so precious to me that we are having this conversation. Not because you were formerly my student, but because you were informally my teacher. And that is that is an ethnic studies principle. An ethnic studies principle is we learn from each other. It's not that I have the degrees which you're getting, which is still necessary, but I feel like it's that we respect that we come with a set of knowledge, and that those sets of knowledge are not always institutionalized. So I think there's something really kind of queer in the most beautiful way about Black studies as a field because it comes out of student activism. So if it comes out of student activism, and particularly that those students were working, were poor, but were committed to creating material resources for their communities, and they were committed to, like I said, I'm at Columbia right now, to the people who can't get on campus because even if they live in that neighborhood, if ethnic studies and Black studies was about not the tower, it was about beyond the tower. That's one of the gifts of it.
Yes.
And I would say that in terms of what makes it meaningful is personally, it's what brought me home. It was what brought me brought me back to the Philippines, brought me to a place where I understand my place in the world. But I feel like because I'm an ethnic studies person, I'm committed to the classroom as a fertile space to train future social justice warriors. And I would say that I'm not sure, and I know that we'll get to kind of critiques later on, but I would say that the roots of Black studies doesn't necessarily mean that's where that is how it continued to grow.
Yes.
But I would say the meaning of the field is that because it was innovated by students, that means that young people always led it, or at least led its vision in its original state.
Mm-hmm.
But that vision was also tied to a larger social vision. And so I would say, in terms of like what we're talking about in terms of the intersection of a study of cultural expression, I think one of its greatest strengths is its interdisciplinarity. It's always been far and away ahead of its time in that way. Like I said, I feel like one of the first scholars that I really engaged with was Catherine Dunham, who she was a political activist, an anthropologist, and a creator. And then she also moved between like Hollywood and Haiti. So like I feel like her own model is one that I hold dear to, but it's also like and I didn't really answer this question earlier because you asked me about like artists that inspire me. So I would just say that like when I think about the artists that I think of that are my sort of guardian angels, I think about Basquiat, Jean-Michel Basquiat, and Prince, and these are shapeshifters. They are artists who rejected genre and always had fights with the studios. And I very much identify as that. I very much identify as that as a scholar and as an artist, that like I've never been comfortable in the white cube of galleries or the ivory tower, but that because I have, out of an amalgamation of different privileges, art in these spaces. So what am I going to do in those spaces? And so I do think about like I think the other thing I would say too about Black Studies is it's so far-reaching, and there isn't a monolith. And I feel like that's really the point of it, is to say there are so many dimensions. There are so many, you can look at multiple Black Studies departments, fields, or institutes, and they will be very different from each other. And it really ends up being about the leadership. But in its origin state, I would say that Black Studies was committed to all power to all the people, and that there was an internationalist commitment as well, and very much a commitment to class issues, and I feel like in terms of its sort of radical beginnings, and I mean that in the best sense, that radical in the way that we wanted a different world. And and I would just say like that I feel like that is where we need to continue to look ahead.
Yes. Thank you so much. Thank you. It's so interesting reflecting back on your response to the previous question, thinking about your own particular journey into Black studies, ethnic studies, but then also in reflection on how you're talking about the field and the centrality and the leadership of students. I find that parallel to be so just sharp. And I think it speaks to the field itself and the work that is being done, and where the work really is fueled through. Like the students, their imaginations, their political imaginations, and how they're expanded and challenged in these really beautiful ways. And I also really appreciated how you talked about Prince too, and just like the reject is something about this rejecting of like genre, or like this kind of confining and logic, that I think also speaks to like Black studies and these other intellectual political liberation projects. Something about that is really, I enjoyed that, as well as when you mentioned Catherine Dunham, I believe.
Yes.
Like just the multi-dimensional, just the identities that this figure possessed, and then like how their influence in being able to operate in these different capacities. I think that too speaks to how you were getting at the interdisciplinarity of Black studies and how pulling from these different tools and resources is so integral to the project's success, or successes. So thank you so much. And on the topic of interdisciplinarity, or maybe like possessing these multiple, roles that you operate within, your work is informed and enmeshed within so many different experiences, like you mentioned, as artist, as scholar of cultural and ethnic studies, as dancer, as organizer. And I think, and these are just a few to name, but the practices and commitments from these different roles and identities really create an interesting space for the study, or maybe the attentiveness to Black life and Black liberation. So how do you see your work in relation to, I guess, a past of Black studies, as well as like how your work that you're currently in and work like and going through, how does it open up like new horizons for the field, or how does it expand upon some of those key elements like you were just talking about of the field?
Thank you so much for the question. So I feel like this is a good time to introduce you to my mentors when I was getting my master's at NYU at Tisch. And as I sort of spoiler alerted before, I'm really taking this opportunity on the Black Studies podcast to name and claim my elders. And I feel like it in speaking to the people who trained me, I feel like it answers the question. So in addition to Adenike and Johnny Coleman at Oberlin, I also worked with the poet Calvin Hurton, who was a part of a collective on the Lower East Side, and a Black poet. And I remember he wrote my letter of recommendation for NYU, and the scholar who sort of picked it up and was like, oh, was Fred Moten. And I know that he was on this podcast before, which is why it's such an honor to be in his company by way of that. But I remember in performance studies, I trained with Fred Moten, who really helped me understand how to read performance as a social text.
Wow.
And very much influenced by jazz as well. And I would say, too, I also worked with Kamal Brathwaite, the poet and philosopher from Barbados. And he really trained me to understand the usefulness of magical realism as an important methodology for survival, but also how poetry and sort of what he would call the sycorax, which is like a maroon space, how important it is to sort of like go underwater sometimes, or go in the cave, or go in the mountain, or go into and understand how like not only land spaces, but I just remember him like explaining patterns of the ocean and how you can just the multiple ways of transmission. And I would say, like, in connection to the question that you're asking about, how does my work now relate to the past of Black studies? I would say that I'm still very much firmly rooted in the project of the classroom, that the classroom is the captive audience. It's the space where we build. And I think of it very much as a lab where it's a microcosm, and that like every semester I have the opportunity to create intellectual community with these bright minds. And I definitely feel like it's because of the ethos of Black studies, which is, to me, an ethos of love. It's like the project is, in the face of all of the ways, like I'm a visual culture person too, and all of the ways that, like, as Stuart Hall calls it, the racial regime, like in the face of the ways that of distortion, how do we find ourselves back to our humanity? How do we find ourselves back to what makes us human and divine? And so I think about Kamau, like you were in my classroom, and the ways that I really tried to elbow the doorway, to be like, okay, and just try to make sure that he was the professor who told me and my colleagues, you are not lucky to be here. The university is lucky to have you.
Mm.
And I remember feeling like, oh, that's right. Yeah, let me try that. Hold on, let me try that, because I had not thought about what we were bringing. I just think that there's something so sort of like transactional now about the university, and like so many of us have the student debt to show for it. We're the ones working, but we're the ones paying at the same time. It's like very, but I feel like in that moment, I remember thinking that, like, yes, I want to commit myself to this kind of work, the kind of work where I'm a part of young people's journey towards themselves. And also feeling like in those years of training that that's what it really was, that it was like, okay, here's a pile of books and let me go through them and figure out which tools are useful to me. And then the ones that are not, like, how can I distance myself from them? And I think, and I'm saying this to you as you're in your graduate journey, like, I do think that it's important to know what are thorns and what are like, oh, that's a bush full of things. Like, when I walk through it, it's going to hurt. So like making the decision, like I'm wise enough to know to go around that thing. But also when like, so-called mentors are like, no, walk through it. It's fine. It's like just, that's when you do have to call upon your own sort of like intellectual ancestors and be like, okay, let me get my sort of like Teflon on, like I'm not doing this colonial museum studies BS without, making sure that I have Frantz Fanon with me. You know what I'm saying? So like,
yes,
making sure that you're able to so I would just say that like, that was, and I would say that in terms of like where my work is now, it's really interesting because I feel like in my own experiences from university to university that writing still remains king in terms of making sure that you have sort of markers of where you've been as a thinking person. But I also find myself more and more drawn to essay writing because it is, I feel like, more accessible, and trying to make my work more accessible. And yeah.
thank you. No, I really appreciate that, and especially with that note that you were ending off on as far as accessibility in terms of like the writing and the intellectual creative labor that you're doing, being able to have it in these different forms, take up these different mediums, because the work, like you were saying, like Black Studies beyond just the tower, like it being this project, not just relative to the university.
Yes.
And I really appreciated when you said, no, the university is lucky to have you, because it also pulls back in like empowering the people doing this labor and the work, and also showing that this work isn't just in service of a particular institution, but rather a collective project. I really appreciated that, especially too when you mentioned how, and even in your journey, thinking about, okay, what tools do I want to bring? And not just for the self-serving, but because I have a responsibility to those coming next. And that is something that I hope this isn't lofty when I say it, but like I find that to be sacred. Because that is like a passing down of wisdom. That is a real way of caring, because like you said, there are thorns. Like there are harmful things and violent things, and to be able to be a person to be so committed to the classroom and be so committed to the student, and to therefore in those commitments have a particular kind of mode in which you're operating. Like I really appreciate that. And as as somebody who was formerly in your classroom, I can say that I also feel that through your praxis and how you are as an educator. So your PhD was in American Studies, and I'm interested to know how your training and experience in that interdisciplinary space was significant to your research, teaching, organizing, and thinking. And if possible, does the training in American Studies help you or feed into your imagining of the relationship between Black studies and ethnic studies?
Thank you so much. So yes, I did American Studies at the University of Hawai'i at Manoa. And I always like to say that I did American Studies, but I did so at the edge of empire in the middle of the ocean. And because it was in Hawaii, which I would say remains a space that is in that has a present sovereignty movement, that it really shifted my understanding about how to think about settler colonialism. And so with my Black studies training, but also my performance studies training, coming into American studies was unique in the way that the things that I was I would say, forging on my own in terms of at Oberlin, I was a Black studies major, but I also took a lot of Asian American studies courses, but we didn't have a department. We barely had a line, like a tenure line. I shout out to my comrades because I feel like we were a part of helping create an Asian American studies line in the 90s. And so by the time I got to Hawaii, it was interesting because one of the people I studied with at NYU was Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who is the Kenyan novelist and playwright, and he was good friends with Haunani K. Trask, who was my kumu and professor, and he was a part of establishing the Center for Hawaiian Studies. So there's a theme here in terms of at Oberlin, the Department of African American Studies was created by students, but it was also very much there was always a sense that the thing that was being built could not be fragile. It could not be it would be forever vulnerable. And so what are the ways to shore up sort of securities around the longevity of these, not just the field, but the spaces themselves? So like I said, at Columbia, there's the Institute for Research in African American Studies, founded by Manning Marable. And then you have the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity at Columbia with Gary Okahiro. And then at Hawaii, I'm seeing Haunani K. Trask and the ways that the student activism and I would say the larger sovereignty movement helped to establish the field. And so I'm training with scholars who are organizers. I'm training with scholars who are organizing and came out of student organizing movements. So it's very hard for me to ever kind of take it apart. And it's also, I would say, impossible for me not to impart that to my students as well. Because what is the point of doing the heavy lifting for students to claim their intellectual leadership if they don't then know it's important to use that to serve the greater good in an organizing principle? So I feel like, and I would say too, I don't know how to relate this exactly, but I also, during my time in Hawaii, really struggled with sort of giving up what I felt like was giving up performing. I felt like I had to figure out a way where writing could also still be my art and my activism. Mm-hmm. And I feel like I really struggled because I felt like all of the things that I wanted to do in my writing was not considered scholarly enough. I was too fun.
Yes.
But I guess but I will say too that I had to really, it's just really interesting because I feel like, so much of graduate work is teaching you how to be a very good puppet, how to be a ventriloquist. Everybody wants you to be able to say everyone else's ideas, but in the very end, you're supposed to have your own. So I think that and I will say too that I feel like that is where the emergence of Basquiat came to me in terms of like, oh, I really identified with him as somebody who wanted to make his mark in the art world, but not compromise. And I felt that way about not so much about the academy, but I knew that my survival in that environment was tied to seeing the non-conformists do it too. And I'm not sure if I'm getting away from the question. Oh, the relationship. Okay. So I would just say with like Haunani K. Trask, she was also like comrades with Angela Davis. And I remember one of my first days at the University of Hawaii going to a conference and seeing the Caribbean poet Wole Soyinka on like a big screen and just being like, oh, the islands. So the relationship between like Haiti and Hawaii. And it turned out that there was one, like in terms of Basquiat's, connection to the islands. And like understanding that like even plantation labors and sugar and thinking about these different migration cycles, but also, like I said, the resistance movement, how connected they were. And so I would just say in terms of the relationship between ethnic studies and Black studies, as well as American studies, I feel like Hawaii was really a place where I could refine my understanding of both settler colonialism within island spaces, including the Caribbean, but also internationalism and thinking about Black studies in relationship to internationalist movements and how the histories of Black folk and the histories of Asian folk and island folk and Pacific Islander folk, that I was able to really start like putting things in order and understanding how linked the histories were, even though I feel like within the fields, there's a different kind of approach to different kinds of approaches and different sort of like hallmarks of those histories. But I feel like they exist in my own brain and being in a particular way, but that it took kind of that whole journey between like, Ohio, New York, Hawaii, and other places for me to really understand it.
Thank you so much. Geography that kept popping up for me as something that was so vital to your scholarship thinking, but also like your being, because the knowledge that you are holding within yourself through those interactions, through the witnessing of these really grand institutions coming about through the labor of different intellectual student or professor organizers. And I think it's really fascinating too that you spending time in Hawaii and being able to draw those connections by understanding your, as well as the geographical relationship to empire, and that drawing you to the work of Basquiat. That is something too that is interesting. And then especially because you're talking about nonconformity, like in this response, I'm like, okay, how do we, understanding that we are in a space in which we are perceived as threat because of this nonconformity. So there is something that is coming back. How do we protect ourselves? How do we shore up just enough to secure ourselves, because we are so vulnerable as you are taking up these spaces with these political intentions and projects at your core and heart. I really appreciate that a lot. So I'm going to transition to this question of critique.
Mm-hmm.
Over the past 50 years, what do you think Black Studies has done well? And what do you think are some things that it has not done particularly well, things that may or can be improved?
So I think about the interdisciplinarity as one of its greatest strengths, but also how that interdisciplinarity and the ways that culture, specifically thinking about music, but also performance, is such a part is also both the method, the theorization, but also in and of itself, the body of knowledge as well. I mean, no pun intended, but like the that the field is always everywhere. So I think that that there's something so genius about Black studies in that way. In terms of what it hasn't been great at, I would say that when I think about its roots as a part of student activism, I'm not, and I would say that I'm saying this sort of gingerly, but it's something that I really feel. There was a time when Black studies was shelter for Black students and poor students. And I would like to think that that is still the case. But I would say that but I would say that, like, as we were talking about how identity-based departments and fields are under siege under Mein Trump, that's what I'll call it, that I feel like I think something that is difficult to do is to resist the coercion and violence of the academic industrial complex. And that I think that it's really hard for any field, but that there is a contradiction in studying social movement, but then doing it from a place that's sort of, oh my God, sorry, I'm just going to have a keep it real with you moment where I'm just like, more so than what Black studies isn't doing well, I would just sort of offer my wish of what I hope it becomes more of, or the thing that I wish. But I would say too that I feel like I'm reasonable, even on an organizer level of like, okay, how do you maintain place and not collaborate? I don't know. I feel like being in collaboration with institutions that are so entrenched in white supremacy, it's like, I'm not sure what the solution is. But I will say that I feel like my own experiences that drew me there, and the things that I value most in terms of its commitment to students, is something that I would urge anybody in the field to continue to draw from and contribute to.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. And I appreciate how you offered that wish, that imagining that commitment that you feel is vital to having a future of Black studies.
Yes.
Is that the centrality of the student. And I think the student as individual, but the student also as like a practice, I feel like that is very vital. And I appreciate the wisdom that you're giving. And because I appreciate it so much, I have another question. And this is our final one. What questions do you think are most urgent and that you want us all to be asking and sitting with in this current moment?
Oh my goodness. Well, it's over. No. Oh my gosh. I mean, I'm saying this, what is it? It's April. It's the day after April Fool's Day. And I think about, let's just put a hypothetical out there that we are experiencing the fall of empire. And what's next? So I think about even the last question about what does Black studies not do particularly well. I think about how my own experiences of observing social movement and being a part of social movements, abolitionism and mutual aid are two things that we should be implementing within Black studies. And I don't just mean that in material ways, but I also mean that in the way of knowledge production, that there ought to be the abolitionist question to me is, how do we get what we need? How do we nurture each other, feed each other, make sure we are all safe and housed? Those are those basic questions. And how can Black studies help to answer those questions? And how do we make it so that our work and our scholarship is mapping out new societies, new ways of new ecosystems, in a world where it's literally on fire, where we're shaking, the earthquakes, the wildfires, the floods, at these end of times moments, what is most important to us, and how do we make it so that our scholarship, our teaching, our books, our performances are still part of addressing those basic needs. So I would say right now that's what I'm thinking about is like, what is Black Studies go bag? What does it look like? What do we keep and what do we throw? And I feel like it is really deep to me when I think about the ways that the institutionalization of Black Studies, it's deep to me the ways that there is still a barter there. Like I feel like going back to that and I remember now the name of the class from Aranika was Jazz Improvisation. And I feel like this is kind of an interesting way to sort of end our interview. But one of the things that I feel like I learned early on was the story of Robert Johnson going to the crossroads and selling and having to barter, his soul for the music. And I think that the university finds itself at that crossroads sometimes, and that we have to decide what are we bartering. And but I would also say too, the genius of the blues is like, it doesn't have to be resolved. You can have both. I mean, sort of like, and I would just say too, when I thought about the beginning of the question of like, how did I come into Black studies and the study of Black life? And shout out to my folks, Dr. Sylvester and Mrs. Virginia Almiron, who were immigrants that came over during martial law in the Philippines in the early 70s, which we didn't talk, which is very much a part of my own politicization process, being raised by immigrants who were a part of a very particular political moment in the Philippines in terms of its people power movements. But in raising me, at some point, they were like, okay, we don't know how to quite negotiate this school system, which me and my siblings experienced a lot of different kind of racial bullying, amongst other things. And so they sent me to a school that was across the river. So like I literally had to cross the Hudson River every day as a young person. So as a 10-year-old, I was doing like a 2-hour commute every day to school. But because I grew up in the 80s, we had the radio. And so on these long bus rides, we had WBGO, the jazz station, WBLS, the Black radio stations. And I remember really listening to Black music all this time. And I remember, like, shout out to the New City Library's jazz collection. I remember, because I was listening to the radio so much, I had to, at some point I would follow the artist. And I knew inside of that music, there were keys to my own liberation. And like what I said before about stage directions, I was really drawn to Charlie Parker. And I remember, fast forward to my graduate life, and I remember seeing Basquiat's sculpture called Now's the Time, which was based upon Charlie Parker. And so I would just say, in terms of what are the most urgent questions of Black studies? I feel like I think about bebop, and I think about how, what do we do with the notes that we already have? How can we actually change the scale so that we can do what I feel like Kamau Brathwaite said, can we make maps to the underground? Can we use the ocean to remap our dreams? Can we use dream time for a new world? And so I would just say that I really am so indebted to the field, but we're not done yet. This iteration of Black studies and the ways that it, I am hesitant to say it, but it's the truth. The ways that in some capacities has collaborated with the bourgeois, the bourgeois, and has alienated its its originators in terms of working poor students. We have to do a new thing. We have to do a new thing. But I would say that knowing scholars, performers like you, artists like you are at the helm of the new vanguard is more than enough for me to know that we're in good hands.
Oh my gosh. Thank you so much. I want to say thank you first and foremost for your wisdom the gems you are dropping. I keep coming back to the student, but when you were talking about, mutual aid, like do people have what they need simply to just exist and survive, let alone already have like in being active within this liberation project, and how that is integral to the essence of Black studies, and calling us all back into that, I think is really necessary and valuable in this moment. And I really like the idea of creating these new ecosystems. So asking questions like, creating new ecosystems, and then thinking, like you were saying, with the notes that we already have, like calling in these different cultural formations in this process of creating these new ecosystems. I feel like that's so necessary and so valuable. I appreciated the language that you put to it. It gave me a different perspective. And now is the time. Yeah, I appreciate your genius, and I appreciate the wisdom that you shared. And I want to say again, thank you so much for coming to the Black Studies podcast. I appreciate the wisdom that you shared, your experiences that you shared with myself as well as our listeners. I speak on behalf of the entire podcast when I say we're thankful to have you here today.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the invitation. And again, it's just such an honor to build a new world with you. And just thank you so much. And so many blessings to you and yours. I cannot wait for the next.